265 pounds bodybuilder racist insults Bruce Lee. 5 seconds later, out of breath. There is a particular kind of silence that only happens in large public spaces when something is about to go very wrong, or very right, and the people standing nearby suddenly understand they are about to witness something they will describe to their grandchildren. The check-in hall of San Francisco International Airport does not seem, at first glance, like the kind of place where that silence would ever fall. It is Saturday morning, September 1972. The terminal smells of jet fuel and stale vending machine coffee. Half a dozen domestic flights are boarding simultaneously. Luggage is everywhere, piled in uncertain towers, dragged across the linoleum by people who have somewhere to be and not enough time to get there comfortably. The United Airlines check-in queue is 20 people deep, the kind of line that shifts and shuffles with the restless collective energy of travelers who have already been awake longer than they wanted to be, running the quiet arithmetic of whether they will make their flight. And standing third in that line, relaxed and patient, in a black leather jacket over a white shirt, dark trousers, and sunglasses that partially obscure his face, is Bruce Lee. He is 31 years old. He is 5 feet 7 inches tall. He weighs approximately 140 pounds. He is carrying a gray Samsonite suitcase with 3 days of clothing packed inside, along with documents for producer meetings in Los Angeles, meetings that, over the next several months, would ultimately lead to the production of Enter the Dragon, the film that would cement his name as one of the most recognizable on the planet. He looks, to anyone passing by who does not recognize him, like a man who has done this many times and has made his peace with waiting. His posture is centered, unhurried, entirely present. A few whispers move through the line around him. That's the guy from the Green Hornet. The murmurs dissolve before they become anything larger. He is simply a man waiting to check a bag on a Saturday morning. He is simply a man who has spent 20 years building a fire inside himself, and today he is just waiting in a line. And then the bodybuilder arrives. The man the mirror made to understand what is about to happen at that check-in counter. You have to understand the world that built the man who was about to walk through that terminal door. The early 1970s were the beginning of what historians of fitness now call the golden era of bodybuilding. Arnold Schwarzenegger had won 4 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles between 1970 and 1973. Gold's Gym in Venice Beach, California, had become the most famous gym in the world, a place where men came not just to exercise but to sculpt themselves into something they believed would be beyond challenge. The documentary Pumping Iron, released in 1977, would eventually capture this world and introduce it to mainstream America, but in 1972, the culture was already fully formed. It had its own magazines, its own vocabulary, its own system of values. And central to that system was a very specific belief about what physical size meant in the real world. The belief was this: large muscles, visible mass, impressive arms and chest, these things translated directly into power. Not just in competition, not just on the posing stage, but everywhere. In gyms. In parking lots. In check-in queues at airports. The man with the biggest arms commanded deference. The man with the broadest chest moved through the world differently than everyone else. People stepped aside, unconsciously and automatically, the way smaller objects yield to larger ones. In a culture that measured worth in inches of muscle and pounds on the scale, this was not perceived as intimidation, it was simply understood as the natural order. The man who enters the terminal at 9:22 on that September morning has spent 6 years building himself according to these values. He is 28 years old, 6 feet 1 inch tall, and weighs 265 pounds. He competes in amateur heavyweight bodybuilding out of San Jose. His chest measures 52 inches. His arms measure 22 inches around. He is wearing a tight white tank top despite the September morning chill because the arms are, as far as his training philosophy is concerned, always the point. He has a companion, similarly built, walking half a step behind him. These two men move through the terminal the way the ocean moves through a narrow harbor, not with aggression exactly, but with displacement. With the deep, settled confidence of people who have spent 6 years being given room in every room they have ever entered, and who have therefore concluded, on some level below conscious thought, that the room belongs to them. He reaches the check-in queue. He does not join it at the end. He begins moving along its length from the back toward the front, applying lateral pressure with his shoulder to the first person in line, a businessman with a briefcase, who steps aside without protest. Then to the second person, an older woman who pulls her bag to her chest and says nothing. He has never once had to say a word during this maneuver. His body does the talking, and for 6 years, bodies have answered. He reaches Bruce Lee and applies the same pressure. The same wordless lateral push. The same assumption, encoded in his muscles through thousands of days of iron and mirrors, that the smaller body will yield to the larger one because that is simply the physics of the situation. Bruce Lee does not move. He shifts his weight perhaps 2 or 3 degrees, rotates slightly, and the push finds no purchase. No leverage. No compliance. He continues looking toward the counter as though nothing has touched him. Because, in any meaningful sense, nothing has. The man in the line here is what that bodybuilder does not know about the man he has just attempted to push out of the way. Bruce Junfan Lee was born in San Francisco on November 27, 1940, in the Hour of the Dragon, a coincidence of Chinese astrology that would become one of the better-known pieces of biographical shorthand about him, though the reality of what he built in his 32 years of life needs no mythological framing to be remarkable. His father, Li Huichen, was a celebrated Cantonese opera star on tour with a company that had traveled to the United States. The family returned to Hong Kong when Bruce was 3 months old. He grew up in the Kowloon district during the post-war years, a street-fighting kid in a city that had hundreds of martial arts schools and a culture of rooftop brawling among young men from rival schools. He was, by most accounts, genuinely difficult to contain. His family eventually enrolled him at age 13 with IP Man, the Wing Chun grandmaster whose school would shape the foundational architecture of everything that came after. He trained under IP Man for roughly 5 years. Wing Chun is not a large movement martial art. It is built on economy, on centerline control, on the geometry of close-range engagement. It trains the practitioner to intercept force before it has fully developed, to redirect rather than absorb, to generate power from the most efficient possible chain of motion rather than from raw muscular output. These principles would become the core of everything Bruce Lee developed over the next 2 decades, though he would eventually move far beyond any single style. He came back to the United States in 1959 at age 18, enrolled at the University of Washington in Seattle, and began teaching martial arts to support himself. He opened schools in Seattle, then Oakland, then Los Angeles, where his students eventually included Steve McQueen, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Sharon Tate, and Chuck Norris. In 1964, at the Long Beach International Karate Championships in California, he gave a demonstration of his speed and power that people who witnessed it still describe in terms that strain against the limits of what the human body is supposed to be able to do. The 1-inch punch, a strike delivered from a distance of 1 inch that could launch a full-grown man backward across a room, was not a trick of physics or a prepared setup. It was the output of a nervous system that had been trained for years to recruit every possible unit of force from the ground up, through the legs, through the rotating hips, through the core, through the shoulder and arm, into a contact point roughly 2 inches square. He moved to Hong Kong in 1971 after years of watching Hollywood give his ideas to other people and cast white actors in roles built for an Asian lead, most famously the TV series Kung Fu, based on a concept he had developed and pitched himself, which ultimately starred David Carradine. The racial mathematics of 1960s and 1970s Hollywood were not subtle. Asian actors were cast as villains, as comic servants, as props in other people's stories. The idea that American audiences would accept an Asian man as the hero of an action story was considered, in executive meeting rooms at major studios, to be commercially unviable. Bruce Lee knew this. He had lived it. And he had gone back to Hong Kong, where his first 2 starring films, The Big Boss in 1971 and Fist of Fury in 1972, broke every Hong Kong box office record previously set. Warner Brothers, presented with those numbers, reconsidered their position on commercially unviable. By September of 1972, negotiations for Enter the Dragon were in active progress. Bruce Lee was flying to Los Angeles to meet with producers Fred Weintraub and Paul Heller. He was, at that moment, simultaneously the biggest film star in Asia, an emerging Hollywood phenomenon, a philosopher who had published serious writing on martial arts theory, and a man who had spent more than 20 years refining the question of how force actually works, not in a gym, not in front of a mirror, but in the real and unscripted world. He was also, to the bodybuilder who had just tried to push him out of a check-in queue, simply a small man in a leather jacket who appeared to weigh 140 pounds and who had, incomprehensibly, not moved. The escalation. The bodybuilder stops. He has not encountered this before. He looks at Bruce with the expression of a man whose arithmetic has produced an impossible result and who is not yet sure whether to recalculate or simply insist more loudly on his original answer. "Hey," he says. "Big guy coming. Move it." Bruce does not turn immediately. He continues facing forward. When he does turn, it is slowly and completely, with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who is not afraid of what they are turning to face. He looks up at the man from behind his sunglasses for a moment. Then he removes the sunglasses and folds them into his jacket pocket with the same careful, economical motion he applies to everything. "The line is for everyone," Bruce says. His voice is calm and perfectly level. Not loud. Not aggressive. Simply clear. The way a fact is clear. "Wait your turn." The bodybuilder blinks. He expected compliance. He expected apology, nervous laughter, the immediate physical yield that his size has reliably produced for 6 years without requiring a single word. He did not expect this. The calmness is more disorienting than aggression would have been, because aggression he knows how to answer. Calmness of this particular variety, the calmness of a man who simply has nowhere to be afraid of, does not compute within the value system he has built. He looks at Bruce. He looks at his own arms. He runs the comparison that 6 years of gym culture have trained his mind to run automatically. He sees 140 pounds, maybe 150 with the jacket. He sees arms that are functional but unremarkable. He sees someone who should, by every physical metric he has ever trusted, be moving. "Buddy," he says, and his voice carries the particular patience of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow. "I'm twice your size. Move, or I'll move you." Bruce responds without changing expression, without raising his voice, without shifting his weight in any way that could be read as preparation for what comes next. He simply says, "Try." One word. Not a threat exactly. An invitation. A door opened with perfect courtesy into a room the bodybuilder is not equipped to enter. At this point, a United Airlines counter agent intervenes with the specific combination of authority and appeasement that customer service training produces. "Gentlemen, there are no confrontations here. Everyone will be served in order. Please maintain your positions in the queue." The bodybuilder steps back. He positions himself directly behind Bruce, and he waits, with the particular impatience of a man who has decided he will find another opportunity to establish the hierarchy that this unreasonably calm person has temporarily disrupted. The opportunity presents itself when Bruce reaches the counter and places his suitcase on the scale. The suitcase is not fully latched. Bruce had been organizing documents in it while waiting and had not resecured the clasp completely. The bodybuilder, standing directly behind him, sees this. What happens next can technically be described as an accident. A large foot moving clumsily in a crowded space making contact with luggage on the floor. That is one description. The other description is that the bodybuilder drives his foot into the side of Bruce's suitcase with enough force to knock it off the scale and send it skidding across the linoleum, the unlatched clasp giving way, the contents spreading across the terminal floor. 2 shirts. A pair of training trousers. Personal items fanning out across the tile while 40 people watch. And then the bodybuilder laughs. It is a specific kind of laugh, the laugh of a man who has found a way to assert dominance while maintaining plausible deniability. Then he turns to his companion and says it, at a volume calculated to reach Bruce and everyone within 10 meters. "Look at the little Chinese guy picking up his garbage. Should learn not to be in the way of bigger people." A few people nearby look away. The airline employee behind the counter goes very still. Bruce Lee does not react visibly. He kneels down on the linoleum floor of the terminal and begins picking up his clothing. His movements are deliberate and unhurried. The movements of a man who has decided exactly how he is going to respond to this situation, and who is in absolutely no rush to get there. He folds the first shirt carefully, as though he is in his bedroom at home. He folds the second. He places the training trousers on top. He picks up each personal item individually and places it back in the suitcase. The bodybuilder's laughter continues for a while. Then it begins to thin at the edges as the silence from Bruce stretches longer than expected. The laughter requires a reaction to sustain itself. Bruce is not providing one. The bodybuilder fills the silence with another comment to his companion about how some people just don't understand that the world has a natural order. But the words have less weight than before. Bruce finishes repacking his suitcase. He stands up. He closes the clasp with a clean, decisive click. He turns and faces the bodybuilder directly, with the complete and unhurried attention of someone who has finished everything he needed to finish, and now has time for this. The 40 people in the surrounding area who have been watching this unfold go completely quiet. The counter agent stops typing. Even the ambient noise of the terminal seems to pull back slightly, the way sound behaves in a large space when something is about to happen that demands full attention. Bruce speaks clearly and without performance, projecting his voice not through volume but through precision. Each word lands exactly where it is aimed. "You're going to apologize," he says, "or I'm going to demonstrate why size without skill is just dead weight." He says it the way a physician states a diagnosis. Not as a threat. As an assessment of the available facts. 5 seconds the bodybuilder stares. He runs the calculation one more time. 140 pounds. 5 feet 7 inches. Arms that are not particularly impressive. He has done this calculation before, and the answer has always been the same, and the answer has always been correct. He decides this situation is no different. He smiles at his companion. Then he takes one step toward Bruce and extends his right hand toward Bruce's chest. Open palmed. The dominant push, the move that establishes hierarchy without technically crossing into assault. The move that has ended a dozen minor confrontations in his favor without ever requiring him to actually fight anyone. The hand never reaches Bruce's chest. What happens in the next 5 seconds is this. In the first second, Bruce's left hand intercepts the incoming push at the wrist, not blocking it with force but redirecting it outward in a motion so smooth and economical that several witnesses later describe it as looking like the bodybuilder's own arm simply changed its mind about where it was going. This is the interception principle of Jeet Kune Do in its most direct form. Meet the attack during preparation, before it has generated momentum, at the moment when it costs the least energy to redirect. In the second, Bruce's right leg generates a sidekick that travels from its chambered position to the bodybuilder's solar plexus in a time that the human eye cannot follow reliably at standard observation conditions. Here is what actually produces the force in that kick, because this is where the physics become genuinely extraordinary. The power does not come from the size of the muscles involved. Bruce Lee's legs, by bodybuilder standards, are not impressive. The power comes from the kinetic chain, the coordinated sequence of the entire body working as a single mechanism. The legs push against the floor, generating ground reaction force. The hips rotate, converting that upward force into rotational momentum. The torso contracts, transferring rotational momentum through the core to the extending limb. The leg extends, channeling everything that has been built through the chain into a contact point roughly 2 inches square, at the anatomical location where the impact will be most efficiently transferred to the diaphragm. Bruce Lee at 140 pounds, when focused through that kinetic chain into that point, generates impact that exceeds what 265 pounds of untrained mass can produce in a comparable movement. The muscle was never the point. The nervous system was the point. The coordination was the point. The 20 years of training were the point. In the third second, the impact reaches the bodybuilder's diaphragm. Medically, what happens is called phrenospasm, a reflexive spasm of the diaphragm caused by sudden force applied to the celiac plexus, the dense nerve network located behind the stomach near the first lumbar vertebra. The diaphragm is the muscle responsible for pulling air into the lungs. When it goes into spasm, it cannot contract or relax properly. The lungs stop functioning correctly. The mouth opens. No sound comes out, because no air is moving in either direction. The hands go instinctively to the midsection, the ancient reflex of a body trying to protect the site of injury after the injury has already occurred. Recovery typically takes 1 to 2 minutes. In the 4th second, Bruce's left leg executes a sweep that removes the bodybuilder's support leg at the precise moment when all 265 pounds of his weight is committed to that leg, because the kick has already destabilized his center of gravity forward and down, forcing his weight onto that one remaining support. The geometry of what follows is simple and completely inevitable. Remove the only remaining support at the moment when the center of gravity is already displaced, and the result is not a fall. It is a collapse. Total, immediate, and following all the laws of physics without exception. In the 5th second, 265 pounds of bodybuilder meets the linoleum floor of San Francisco International Airport with an impact that travels through the building like a minor seismic event, reverberating in the bones of every person standing within 20 feet. He lands on his back. Arms and legs extended without control. Completely conscious. Completely unable to do anything about his situation, which is the floor, the inability to breathe, and 40 people watching him from above. Bruce Lee does not follow him to the ground. He does not stand over him. He does not say a single word. He turns back to the airline counter, picks up his suitcase, and addresses the agent, who is standing with both hands flat on the counter and an expression that indicates her customer service training did not include a protocol for this specific situation. "Excuse the interruption," Bruce says. "My bag is within the weight limit." The agent looks at the scale. "Yes," she says, in a voice operating on automatic pilot while her conscious mind processes what it has just witnessed. 42 pounds. Well within the limit. She prints the boarding pass. Bruce thanks her, and walks toward the seating area with the unhurried calm of a man who has completed his check-in and has some time before his flight. The science he brought to understand why those 5 seconds happened the way they did. You have to understand what Bruce Lee had been building for 20 years and what the bodybuilder had been building for 6. The bodybuilder had been building a body that looks dangerous. This is not a small thing. The golden era of bodybuilding, which was reaching its cultural peak in exactly this period, 1972, the year Arnold Schwarzenegger was winning his 3rd consecutive Mr. Olympia title, was built on the display of physical capability. The central practice was the isolation of individual muscle groups, training each to its maximum visual development. Bench press for chest. Curls for biceps. Squats for quads. The competition stage rewarded size, symmetry, and definition. It was, at its best, a genuine athletic achievement. But the training was explicitly organized around isolated movements, around the appearance of power, around what the body looked like when it was displayed. What it was not organized around was the kinetic chain. In functional combat movement, and this distinction was absolutely central to Bruce Lee's entire training philosophy, the relevant unit is not the individual muscle. It is the sequential coordination of the whole body. The foot pushes against the floor. The knee extends. The hip rotates. The core transfers momentum. The shoulder generates final velocity. The arm extends into the target. Every part of the body contributes to a single output that exceeds what any single muscle group could generate on its own. A man who bench presses 300 pounds is genuinely impressive. But the kinetic chain of a bench press lying on your back, pushing upward, shares almost no movement pattern with a kick. The power cannot transfer. The coordination does not exist. The nervous system has not been trained for that specific sequence. Bruce Lee understood this with the clarity of someone who had spent years thinking about almost nothing else. He was, by 1972, bench pressing over 100 pounds with one arm, performing push-ups on 2 fingers, completing curls with 70-pound dumbbells. He was not weak. But he had deliberately avoided training for bulk, because he had learned early that excessive muscle mass reduces speed, and speed is central to the kinetic chain's effectiveness. He had dropped from 165 pounds to around 140 because the extra mass slowed him down, and slowness was more dangerous than any reduction in raw strength. His striking speed from a distance of 3 feet had been measured at within 0.05 of a second, so fast that on early film shoots he was asked to slow down because his movements were invisible to cameras running at standard 24 frames per second. He could place his fist 1 inch from the chest of a man twice his size and, through the kinetic chain, generate enough force to launch that man backward across a room. This was not a trick. It was the direct output of 20 years of daily training on the principles of how force actually moves through the human body. The bodybuilder had 265 pounds of muscle. Bruce Lee had 140 pounds of nervous system, 20 years of it, calibrated to the fraction of a second. The outcome was never in doubt. Jeet Kune Do. The way of the intercepting fist. Bruce Lee had been developing Jeet Kune Do, the martial art and philosophy he created, since the mid-1960s, and by 1972 it had reached a level of sophistication that placed it decades ahead of conventional martial arts thinking. The name translates from Cantonese as the way of the intercepting fist, and interception is its core principle, both physically and philosophically. Rather than waiting for an attack to arrive fully formed and then defending against it, the Jeet Kune Do practitioner intercepts the attack during its preparation phase at the moment of intent, before the force has been generated. This is why Bruce's left hand redirected the bodybuilder's push at the wrist rather than blocking it at the point of full extension. By the time a push has fully extended, it carries momentum that must be overcome by direct force. During preparation, when the arm is just beginning to move, it has almost no momentum. Intercepting it there costs almost nothing. Lee had built JKD by doing something almost no martial artist of his era was willing to do. He questioned everything. He had trained in Wing Chun, boxing, fencing, wrestling, and dozens of other systems. He kept what worked in actual unscripted physical encounters. He discarded everything that existed only for tournament performance or aesthetic display. He believed, and argued forcefully in interviews and in writing, that any martial art that was organized around a fixed set of forms and patterns was eventually a dead end, because real physical confrontation is alive and unpredictable, and frozen patterns cannot meet it. He was, in this sense, the forerunner of what would eventually become mixed martial arts, the recognition that the best fighter is not the purest practitioner of any single style, but the most adaptable person who has internalized the principles that work regardless of context. He told the karate instructor who approached him in the waiting area after the incident exactly this. It wasn't a specific system. It was the application of principles. Intercept the attack during preparation, before it generates momentum. Strike the center of mass at the point where damage is maximized. Use the opponent's committed weight against him. Those principles work regardless of the style you practice. Bruce Lee also deeply understood the discipline of restraint, what he called the goal of real confrontation, which was never to destroy an opponent but to end the threat. The moment the bodybuilder was on the floor, unable to breathe, the threat was over. Continuing would have been something other than defense, and that something else, as Bruce explained to the Korean War veteran who spoke to him in the waiting area, creates legal and moral problems that the original defense did not. The discipline of stopping, he said, is as important as the skill of acting. This is not a passive philosophy. It is a precise and demanding one. It requires a level of control over instinct and adrenaline that most people who can fight physically never develop. The veteran described it as rarer than the technique itself. Most men who can fight keep fighting past the point of necessity because the adrenaline demands it. Bruce stopped on a dime. The world he was fighting, what the bodybuilder said, in that airport terminal, was not only an act of physical intimidation. The racial component, look at the little Chinese guy picking up his garbage, should learn not to be in the way of bigger people, was a specific kind of cruelty that Bruce Lee had been navigating his entire professional life in America, and that shaped both the fire behind his discipline and the composure with which he carried himself. The 1960s and 1970s in Hollywood were not kind to Asian actors. The roles available to them were as villains, as comic servants, as men defined almost entirely by their foreignness and perceived weakness. When Asian men appeared in American film and television, they were presented as inferior physically, intellectually, and morally to their white counterparts. This was not subtle or incidental. It was structural. It was the water that the industry swam in. Bruce Lee had been told directly, repeatedly, that American audiences would not accept an Asian man as the hero of their own story. When he had pitched his original concept for a martial arts Western TV series, a Chinese man moving through the American frontier, Hollywood had taken the concept, cast a white actor named David Carradine in the lead, and produced Kung Fu, which aired beginning in February 1972 and reached #1 in the ratings. Bruce Lee watched all of this. He did not pretend it was not happening. In an interview during this period, he described his feelings about race and humanity with characteristic directness, noting that race-based fear and hatred were nothing more than formulas handed down from one generation to another, traditions without truth. He, Bruce Lee, refused to follow those formulas. He believed that under the sky, under the heavens, there was but one family. This was not a vague sentiment. It was a position he held with the same precision he applied to everything. His schools were open to students of any race, any background, at a time when many martial arts schools were not. His first student in America was a black man named Jesse Glover. He taught Chuck Norris, Sharon Tate, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He constructed his career around the refusal to participate in the hierarchy that Hollywood and broader American culture wanted to place him in. And so when a man in a check-in queue in September 1972 tried to push him aside physically and then, when that failed, attempted to humiliate him through a racial insult at sufficient volume for 40 strangers to hear, Bruce Lee did not simply experience this as a personal affront. He experienced it as the same system he had been navigating for a decade, made physical and immediate. The composed deliberateness with which he repacked his suitcase before turning to respond was not passivity. It was the patience of a man who had decided exactly how he was going to answer this moment, and who was not going to be rushed into it by someone else's timeline. He told the young woman who thanked him in the waiting area that he had not acted to be a hero. He acted because casual racism, the use of physical size to intimidate smaller people, the assumption that you can take what you want because you are large enough to take it, these things corrode something important. They replace respect with fear. And a culture based on fear is worse for everyone in it, including the people doing the intimidating, because they never learn what they actually are without the intimidation propping them up. What is he without it? She asked. Less than he thinks, Bruce said. Which is the real lesson. Not what happened to him on the floor. What he discovers next. The education no one asked for behind Bruce Lee, on that linoleum floor of San Francisco International Airport, the bodybuilder was beginning the slow process of recovering the ability to breathe. It takes nearly 2 full minutes before he can sit up, assisted by his companion. When he finally gets vertical, he looks around the terminal for Bruce. Not with the intention of continuing anything. With the expression of a man who has just had a fundamental assumption about the world corrected in the most direct way available, and who is still in the early stages of processing the correction. He had believed for 6 years that 265 pounds of muscle was a reliable source of dominance in physical confrontations. That belief is not injured. It is not dented. It is gone. It has been removed with the same efficiency and economy with which everything else in the previous 5 seconds happened. The airport security officers who approached Bruce in the waiting area before boarding noted, after speaking with 6 witnesses, that every single account confirmed the same sequence. The bodybuilder had been the clear aggressor, and Bruce had made verbal attempts at resolution before any physical contact occurred. They informed him he was technically within his rights to file assault charges. Bruce considered this genuinely. No, he said. I want to take my flight. If he learned something today, that is sufficient. The point of the situation was the lesson, not the punishment. The bodybuilder did not file charges. His companion explained to the security officers that his friend had decided not to pursue the matter. The real reason, which the companion did not state but which the officers understood from context, was that the bodybuilder could not construct any version of the story that did not require explaining how he had ended up on the floor after attempting to push a man who weighed 120 pounds less than he did. Any official version of that story could follow him. So he said nothing. He and his companion took a later flight. The bodybuilder spent the entire journey looking out the window at the clouds over California, turning those 5 seconds over in his mind. He had walked into the terminal with a complete and functional theory of how physical power worked in the world. He left it with that theory destroyed. Years later, a bodybuilding magazine published an anonymous interview with a competitor who described learning the difference between aesthetic strength and functional strength through a public confrontation that left him on the floor of a major airport in front of 40 strangers. He described the experience not with bitterness but with the matter-of-fact honesty of a man who had been given an education he hadn't asked for and couldn't refuse. "I had spent 6 years building a body that looked dangerous," he said. "I found out in 5 seconds that looking dangerous and being dangerous are completely different things. The man who taught me that lesson didn't say a word afterward. He just picked up his boarding pass and walked away. That was the part that stayed with me the longest. Not the technique. The fact that for him, it was just something that needed to be dealt with. Something routine. I had been walking around for 6 years thinking my size made me special in a fight. For him, my size was just a Tuesday morning at the airport." He went on to describe beginning boxing training the following month, not to become a fighter, but to understand the difference between muscle that performs and muscle that functions, between the body as display and the body as instrument. The training, he said, changed everything about how he understood himself and how he moved through the world. The fire in the photograph 3 months after that Saturday morning, Black Belt magazine named Bruce Lee the 1972 Martial Artist of the Year. In an interview around this time, when asked about the difference between gymnasium strength and functional combat strength, Bruce gave an answer that has circulated in martial arts training rooms and philosophy discussions ever since. "Large muscle can generate force in isolated movements," he said. "Bench press, curl, squat, those are impressive in their context. But combat is not isolated movement. Combat is kinetic chain. The entire body coordinating in fractions of a second. Each segment contributing to a total force that exceeds what any single muscle group could produce alone. The man at the airport could almost certainly bench press 300 pounds. That is genuinely impressive. But he could not generate meaningful force in a sidekick because he had never trained the kinetic chain of a kick. His muscle was present. His nervous system did not know how to use it in that context. The muscle was there. The coordination was absent. And in the 5 seconds that mattered, coordination was the only thing that mattered." He paused before continuing. "People train their bodies to look strong because strength that is visible gets a response in the gym, in public, in the mirror. That response feels like power. But visible strength and functional strength are related the way a photograph of a fire is related to an actual fire. One looks like the thing. One is the thing. At the airport that morning, he brought a photograph. I brought a fire." This distinction is the one that the entire story pivots on, and it is why the story travels, why it gets retold, why it retains its power more than 50 years after it happened in a terminal that no longer exists in its original form. It is a story about what kind of preparation you have actually done, and what kind of preparation only looks like the right kind. The bodybuilder had done a very large amount of real, genuine, demanding work. 6 years of it. Daily. His commitment was not fake. His effort was not fake. But the work was aimed at a specific goal, the display of physical capability on a stage, in front of judges, within a set of rules that rewarded isolated muscle development. That work made him genuinely formidable within its own context. Outside its context, in the unscripted and immediate 5 seconds of a real physical encounter, it had almost nothing to offer. Bruce Lee had done 20 years of work aimed at a completely different goal. The translation of force from the ground through the body into a target, in the minimum time possible, with the maximum efficiency possible, in whatever form the situation actually required. Not the form of a predetermined style. Not the form of tournament rules. The actual form. Water, as he described it, taking the shape of whatever container it finds itself in. Empty mind. Formless. Shapeless. Like water. The sidekick that connected with the bodybuilder's diaphragm on that Saturday morning was the output of 20 years of this work, showing up in 5 seconds without announcement, without preamble, without any of the social ceremonies that usually precede a demonstration of capability. It was simply there, the way a fire is simply there, not requiring description, not requiring justification, not requiring an audience. Just present, and hot, and real. What remains 50 years on, the story of Bruce Lee and the bodybuilder at San Francisco International Airport has become one of those pieces of biographical legend that travels easily because its central image is instantly recognizable. We all know someone who brought the photograph. We have all, at some point, been in a room where the display of strength was mistaken for the possession of it, in business, in relationships, in competition, in life. The specific form of the mistake changes. The mistake itself is constant. What the story teaches is not that size doesn't matter. Size matters. Physics is real. A 265-pound man is a serious problem for most people in most physical situations. What the story teaches is that size without the nervous system to deploy it is incomplete. That training for display and training for function are not the same project. That the systems you build, over the years you spend building them, will determine what shows up in the moments that test them, and those moments do not give you time to negotiate. Bruce Lee was not, in the end, a large man. He was approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 140 pounds in the period of his peak film work. By the measures the bodybuilder had been using for 6 years, he should have been nobody. He should have been an afterthought. He was the most precise human fighting instrument of his generation, possibly of the century, because he had spent 20 years asking not how do I look, but how does this actually work? And then doing the work that the honest answer to that question required. He boarded his flight to Los Angeles. He sat down. He had a suitcase, a boarding pass, producer meetings to attend, and a film to help make. The film would become Enter the Dragon, and Enter the Dragon would become one of the most financially successful martial arts films ever produced, earning over $400 million worldwide against a budget of $850,000, one of the highest return ratios in Hollywood history. It would introduce Bruce Lee to mainstream Western audiences who had never seen an Asian man carry an American action film. It would launch the careers of multiple co-stars. It would, according to rapper and cultural historian LL Cool J, represent one of the first times many non-white American children had ever seen a non-white action hero on a major screen. None of that was in the suitcase he repacked on the linoleum floor. None of it was in the boarding pass the still-shaking airline agent printed for him. It was in the 20 years of daily work that nobody but him had done. Work aimed not at looking like the thing, but at being it. A Saturday morning in September. A check-in queue. 5 seconds. The photograph, and the fire. That difference is still waiting to be learned, every day, by everyone who mistakes one for the other. And some lessons, as the man who landed on the floor of that terminal eventually came to understand, require a very specific kind of teacher. Some teachers appear in airports, wearing leather jackets, carrying gray suitcases, waiting patiently in line for their turn at the counter. Quietly, completely, and then moving on. If this story got into your head the way it gets into mine every time, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who want exactly this kind of content. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. We'll be right here. Thank you for watching.